On behalf of Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA, Canadian Friends of Sabeel, CFOS, and the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem, just a huge welcome. We're very glad you're joining us for this webinar. Also want to send a sincere thank you to those who have helped sponsor us and gotten the word out. So Northern California, Friends of Sabeel, Christian Jewish Allies for a Just Peace in Israel-Palestine, Kairos Puget Sound, and the Kairos Puget Sound Coalition. Also, I saw we had some promotion from the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of PCUSA and Episcopal Peace Fellowship PIN. And if you shared and I missed it, I apologize. Thank you so much for everyone who helped get the word out. I do want to remind you that this session is being recorded as well as live streamed, so you can adjust your name and video accordingly if that is of concern. We will also be having a time for question and answer later in the session, so you can use the chat feature at any time to write a question. So please go ahead and use that as you see fit. And at this time, I would like to introduce our host and moderator, Kathy Bergen. Kathy has been active for Palestine since 1982. She was with the Mennonite Central Committee in Jerusalem for 9 years, in Philadelphia with the American Friends Service Committee for 12 years, director of the Friends Center in Ramallah for 7.5 years, and is now back in Canada. And so she has over 40 years of experience working for justice and peace in the region. And so, Kathy, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jesse, and thank you for all the work you've done on this. You've done a lot of work. I appreciate that kind of work. I know what it's like to be doing that. My job right now is to introduce the panelists. So what I would like to do is, instead of reading the bios that Jesse sent out to everyone, I would just like to add a few things to each of the people. I will introduce Assis Naim, Nora Carney, Mark Ellis, Don Wagner. And then I will start by asking a first question to you, Naim, and then we can take it from there. We have 50 minutes for each of the panelists to speak, as well as some open conversation between the panelists. And then we will look to Jonathan and Kutab, the current director of FOSNA, and Don Wagner, who is well known. I'll introduce both of them a little bit more later. We'll have them do some open conversation and synthesis of what we've heard. So that would be the first 50 minutes, 50. Then after that, we'll have a question and answer, which Jesse and Chad will help me with in terms of getting all the questions together, because I imagine with close to 200 people on right now, there will be several questions out there. I'm also very pleased that Becky Ruether has joined us. Becky, many of us have tried very hard to get hold of you and Mimi. I'm not sure if Mimi's on, your sister, but if you'd be willing to say a few things about your mom later, that would be great. And maybe you could send me a message in the chat, and we could, help that to happen later. Let me proceed. Assis Naim began his journey towards a Palestinian liberation theology when he was doing his doctorate. The books he has written has influenced the thinking of many Christians and much of the Christian leadership around the world. Together, he and others in the group that he established in order to organize the first Liberation Theology Conference to take place in Jerusalem, then have worked to establish what we today call Sabeel. Sabeel continues to be an important organization in Palestine and is currently headed by Omar Harami and the staff in the Sabeel office in Jerusalem. Norma Karmi has had an important part in developing Sabeel. Norma was the after Sabeel, she became the director of Kairos Palestine. She has been a leading voice in the Palestinian Christian community, challenging both people in her own community and internationals to work for peace with justice for her people. Mark Ellis and I met in Jerusalem in the 1980s. I believe it was like in the middle 80s, when he was the director of the Justice and Peace Institute at Maryknoll in New York. As a Jewish liberation theologian, he has had an important influence on Christian churches and Christian leadership and the Christian community across the globe. He has written numerous books, I believe at least 20, I've heard. Again, I haven't read them as fast as he can write them. Mark is the originator of the phrase, the ecumenical deal, and may want to elaborate on that later. Don Wagner is a Presbyterian minister. He has been involved with Palestine and Israel issues since the late 1970s. He was instrumental in establishing the Palestine Human Rights Campaign, one of the first organizations in the US dealing with Israel-Palestine issues. He led this organization for many years. He remains active on these issues until this day and has become a leading expert on Christian Zionism. Jonathan Kutab is a Palestinian attorney who practices in New York, in Palestine, and in Israel. He has lately become, I don't know the month exactly, Jonathan, but he is the current director of Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA. So welcome to all of you. Naeem, let's begin with you. I would like to ask you a question. When you first met Rosemary, what did you think of her theology, and how did you develop your relationship with her?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. It's so wonderful to be together, trying to honor the memory of our friend and mentor, Rosemary Ruether. I still remember, actually, Kathy, you invited me, you told me I had just moved to Jerusalem myself. I was working at St. George's Cathedral at the time, and you came there and you asked me whether I would accompany you in going to Tantur, the ecumenical center in Jerusalem, to hear a speaker who you said she was a theologian and a feminist, also theologian. And so I went with you to hear Rosemary Ruether. We were sitting together, and I still remember she was very eloquent in her presentation, speaking about the evil of anti-Semitism and other related things. And I kept hoping that she will mention the Palestinian struggle, but she really didn't until the end of her presentation. And she mentioned it almost like in passing. And I was disappointed. I was upset. And I think you and I shared that. Why didn't she mention about the Palestinian issue? We came up after the lecture. We went up and met her and talked about it. And I still remember that you, Kathy, made it available or told her that you're ready to take her around. Because I think you and I felt that she, although she knew so much about the Jewish people and about anti-Semitism, she did not really know as much about the Palestinian issue. And I still remember that you took your time. You took her around, she and Herc. In fact, I think you took her to Gaza and you showed her what's happening in Gaza. And in those days, we used to say as Palestinians that if we wanted people to be converted, we would send them to Gaza because they can really see the oppression of our people there. And you did that. You took her and Herc to Gaza, and you also took her to Galilee. So you showed her around, and I still believe that you were instrumental in really helping Rosemary see what was going on there. And I think that was my introduction to Rosemary myself. And I felt that the credit to a large extent goes to you, Kathy, for all the things that you've done. It was maybe the credit to God's providence and to your witness, and that was the beginning of a long relationship with Rosemary. I appreciated very much her emphasis on justice, on truth, and her courage, because she spoke courageously whenever she mentioned the issue of the Palestinian. And finally, I just want to say on this point that as she was already committed to speaking courageously about the evil of anti-Semitism, I felt she became courageous in speaking about the truth of what the Israelis were doing to the Palestinians. So her commitment to truth, to justice, her courage was amazing and inspired me in my own ministry all these years.
Thank you so much, Assis. I just have one other question for you before I go on to Nora and Mark. How, in the long run, as you look back on her, your relationship with her, how do you think she influenced your theology? And how did that develop over the years as you knew her? And as we know, she was very instrumental in both she and Mark in helping to get together the first Palestinian Liberation Theology conference. But how did she personally influence your theology?
Yeah, I mean, she visited us a number of times after our first encounter with her, and every time she came, she was one of the speakers in our conferences, and so I learned so much from her, and I think she opened our eyes to a number of things. And also when she wrote her book, The Wrath of Jonah, was also a very important book, Maybe I think in the beginning she felt that it had not had an impact, but then she worked it over. She worked the manuscript over and came up with a new version of that book. And it was also very, very good and very influential and very impacting to me as well. So I think on many different ways, she was able to really talk about. In fact, if one goes back to the foreword that she had written for my first book, Justice and Only Justice, it is today as relevant in its theology and in its politics as if it has been written recently, So she was amazing. Her perception about the injustice, the way she saw it, the way she expressed it was really amazing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Assis. Nora, where are you? There you are. My first question for you would be, when you first met Rosemary, what was your impression? How did she influence you and your theology? And how do you think she influenced Palestinian feminism in general?
Well, I first met Rosemary at the Palestinian Liberation Theology Conference in March of 1990, which you, Kathy, had a lot to do with organizing. I had read her foreword to Justice and Only Justice. At that time, I was still working with the YWCA, but had been encouraged to attend all the preparatory meetings for liberation theology. So I was interested as a woman, as a human being, but more so because I knew that she was a woman who was speaking. Most of the theologians in our part of the world that we knew were men. And of course, with a different mentality, with a different outlook. So after I had read the foreword that Reverend Naim just spoke about, I was really impressed by the way she could see the injustice. When Assis Naim was speaking, he spoke about his first meetings with her that were not totally promising. But I did not have that experience. My experience was reading her foreword, but also attending that conference. And frankly, at that time, I was not even thinking of what kind of theology it was, okay? Because I saw a woman who had the courage to speak out and to speak about injustice everywhere. So coming from a background of a family of genocide survivors who had a lot of faith because I'm Armenian, I knew that she was responding to my thinking that I always knew inherited from my grandparents. God is a God of all nations, and God is good. So any evil that is happening around us until today in the world is not the work of God. So I really felt very confident. And when I joined Sabil in 1993, until I left in 2010, I had ample meetings with Rosemary, whether it was leading her on a contemporary way of the cross or going and visiting homes of families that were being evicted in Sheikh Jarrah, or just having a simple lunch together in Sheikh Jarrah, where we had the Sabil office in the garden. I really felt she answered my feelings. I'm not a theologian and I'm not a politician, but I know as a human being, she really voiced my feelings that maybe until then I had not had the courage to speak out. So I'm very grateful to her. How did she affect our Palestinian women? Well, first of all, let me say the title of feminist differs from one place to another, okay? And in Palestinian liberation theology, like Assis Naim would say, we have lots of lay theologians who have done theology on the ground, and you know them all. They are the people who were around Assis Naim as board of directors and so on and so forth. But if you are human, you can understand that Rosemary was really seeking equality for all, okay? And for feminists, I won't say feminist, but for women in the Palestinian society who knew about patriarchy in the conservative churches and even the more liberal churches, who until now do not allow women to do lots of things, I think she gave them the courage not to be afraid, because she really says it in several places. Are you going to remain afraid, or are you going to go ahead? And I think many of us, including the Sabeel group, went ahead. And this is how I served a lot of women at Sabeel, through Sabeel, having taken the courage that Rosemary gave me, with her benediction, of course.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Nora.
You're most welcome.
Yeah, we'll come back to you later, to you and Assis. I will introduce, well, I've introduced Mark, but I just want to say, Mark, it's just a pleasure to have you part of us. We couldn't do this without you. You were so instrumental in working with, you know, with everyone, and especially with Naeem and Rosemary and organizing that first conference. I think in one of the other webinars or Zoom meetings actually that we had, you described the moment of the emerging Palestinian liberation theology, the feminist theology that Rosemary brought with her, as being an explosive moment. I'm wondering if you could say a little more about that.
Well, thank you for having me. I met Rosemary 50 years ago, or I encountered her as a young student at a university, Florida State University, where she spoke, and then invited her to Maryknoll, my institute, in 1983. And I remember, this is something about Rosemary. A woman said to me, one of the faculty members, "Why don't you invite Rosemary Ruether?" And I said, "Well, she's never heard of me. She won't even respond to me. She's so famous." And so I invited her, and she wrote back that she knew me, of me. She had read A Year at the Catholic Worker, my first book, and she came. And meeting Rosemary was quite an interesting experience. And then in her home and meeting her husband, Herc, and inviting her back to Maryknoll in 1988 and celebrating Gustavo Guerra's birthday. And then in 1989, we had a whole session on her around the world, and probably the first ever on her, in honor of her. And then we traveled together, often with Naeem, sometimes without. I traveled all over the world with Rosemary. Well, it was explosive because Naeem was rough on Western years, Jewish and Christian. And I say that in wonder. In our first meetings. Now, Jews and Christians from the West meet Palestinians, and it's much easier, but then it was quite different. The emerging Jewish theology of liberation, which I wrote, was explosive. I didn't realize it. I just thought, well, I have to speak. And of course, that was through you, introducing me to Palestinians in 1984. There's a common thread there. And I remember Naeem, you asked Naeem to come hear me speak on a Jewish theology of liberation. And Naeem thought, well, I'm not interested in a liberal Jew. And you said, he's different. And there in that session, which was very explosive, it was packed out. Nobody knew who I was. It wasn't that. It was something in the air. And David Hartman was there. And in the crowd, I saw this guy in a collar with a cross. And I said, he's not Jewish. And that was Naeem Atik. And afterwards, he invited me back to his apartment with my wife and a little boy, and handed me in a Xerox box, I think it was Kinko's, his dissertation, which I brought back to Maryknoll and Orbis Books to publish, and they didn't want to publish it because Palestinians were terrorists. Anyway, we brought Naeem finally to Maryknoll, and it was published, obviously. And in our discussions, we had Naeem and I, well, first of all, the thing about Naeem, I want to say this, was how pastoral he was to everyone, including me.
Yeah.
It wasn't simple for a Jew, and it wasn't simple for Naim with a Jew. And the thing about Rosemary was she was already famous. She didn't need to take on the Palestinians, and she was famous for being pro-Jewish, and she was.
Yes.
And she took a tremendous risk because it was a losing proposition. And so many progressive Jews and progressive women, including feminists, turned their back on Rosemary when she came out for Palestinians. So at that time, now everyone's on progressive theologians are for Palestinians in one way or another. Sometimes it's too easy, in my view. A lot of these are constituency conversions. That is, everyone needs to speak on it. And if you don't speak on Palestinians on their behalf, you're not listened to on the left anymore. So at that time, it was a risk. It was a risk for Naim to deal with me. It was a risk for Rosemary to deal with Naim and me. It was risky, and that's why it was explosive, because it had never been done before, especially in theology. And we were arguing from our traditions, from our context, and from our politics. That combination at that moment was explosive. And if you remember, because you were there in 1987, Michael Walzer, who was the Jewish ethicist who responded to me, when he started to
I
respond,
remember that.
his hands were shaking. I don't know if you noticed that, Naim. He was shaking, and I thought to myself, now I have Parkinson's. But I thought to myself, he has Parkinson's. He was so angry
Yes.
that I would speak about Palestinians as victims of Jewish power. And I remember him saying, the poor are us, not them. And David Hartman, through someone, I got a speaking engagement at the Hartman Institute, but Hartman himself was very arrogant. And I went in to meet him, and he said, well, I'm not, basically, I'm not coming to hear you, you're beneath me. So I said, fine, it's okay.
Wow.
He was there, though, with a big chair. Everyone was on a folding chair, and I remember he was in this very special chair like a king. And it was an explosive meeting. And in the meantime, Abuna Shakur was one of the respondents.
Yes.
There were 3 breaks, and one of them, Hartman encountered Shakur and said to him, you have offended me. And Shakur, always polite, said, I'm so sorry. How did I offend you? And David Hartman, the great liberal, said, your presence offends me. That was what it was. This is before the uprising.
Yes.
This was the spring of '87 when I published Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation. So this was the time. And then with the uprising, of course, and Rosemary then coming with her book and the second edition of my book and Naim's book, and going around publicly speaking, not just writing books and sitting in offices, but going out there in the world. It was dangerous. Now, I didn't even, I wasn't thinking about this or that. I was just saying, I have to find my voice. So we all were finding our voice. Rosemary was, I was, Naim was, in a very explosive situation. And that's why I think it was at the origins. I'm so grateful I was there. There's been a tremendous fallout since then and still. And people have joined, some of them very sincere, and some of them not so sincere. And sometimes some of the ways of arguing are ways of hiding. But we didn't hide. We couldn't hide. And here I'll end here for a moment. I was surrounded by Jewish progressives who were beginning to speak on Palestinian life, but it was all very patronizing. I couldn't understand why they couldn't just say, what we have done historically to the Palestinians is wrong. What we are doing to you, the Palestinians, is wrong. They just couldn't say it. They could say, well, something is going maybe a little bit wrong here. We have to get back to what we initially, they always had a way of covering their tracks. But I couldn't do it. And I don't claim any moral high ground. I just couldn't do it. And so Naeem, Rosemary, and I became a group traveling around the world. It was a motley group, and we got along fine, and we cared for one another at a time when we were meeting each other and meeting each other's cultures and religious outlooks, and they were very different. And that was a time of hope. Now, maybe that was an illusion that we had. That may have been an illusion. But that was a time where we were all finding our voice at a time that was politically ripe, and we kept to it. We didn't hide.
Yes.
And by the way, the last thing I'll say is when I went to a very liberal seminary, Jewish seminary years later, they loved what I had to say. They thought it was fantastic. But the questions that they had was, how could I hang around Naeem Atik and Rosemary Ruether? They accepted my positions, but they thought both of them, because of their voices, were anti-Semitic. And this was a big thing that we had to fight to get over, especially even in the churches, that supporting Palestinian freedom was also supporting Jewish history. It was a solidarity with the best of Jewish history to support the right of Palestinians to be free in their own homeland.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks to all three of you for beginning this discussion. I just, as a brief interruption, before we go to questions and comments between the panelists, I would like to just ask Rebecca Ruether if, and I don't see you right now, Rebecca, but I'm so glad you're here. Would you be willing to say something about your mother? We were not able to get hold of your sister Mimi, but Rebecca, you are living in California. You're a 3D animation specialist. And the last time actually we met in Jerusalem, but also I've met you the last time one of the times when your mother came with a group to Palestine. I was in Ramallah and you came there. I think you were filming the tour at the time. Would you be willing to say a few things about your mother? I didn't introduce her like I was supposed to in the beginning, because I thought everyone has read what I wrote about her. And with you being on, if you're willing to say something about her, just to take a few minutes and do that. Would you be willing to do that now or maybe later, whichever is more comfortable for you?
Well, I better say something now because I'll chicken out later.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, tell us something about Rosemary, this amazing person that we all know different aspects of her. And you, of course, have another view of her as her daughter. So, yeah, please, if you could share some of that with us, that would be great.
Well, I don't know that I have a lot to say because my mom was my mom, and you guys know her as the crusader, speaker of truth, but I would agree with the fact that I found her to be very brave. Somebody who had a loud voice from a very early age and knew what she wanted to do, and all of the things that she seemed to go after, she always backed it up with a lot of history. So I just, in my mind, think she was a historian as much as anything. And anything you read that she wrote, you could hear all the backup information about, how she embedded her point of view into history, and her pursuit of equality began with South America and say LA, the poor in LA as a child, the grape pickers, and so as a child, those things surrounded me. And I just accepted those kind of things, those kind of posters of Palestine in the house and flags of different places. And she traveled all over the world, and people seemed to really embrace her. And that was really nice for me to see. But I always felt a little out of, not in the right. I mean, I'm not her, Like you said, I do computer animation. I followed her artistic bent. And she started off as a painter. And, but I did go into video and stuff. And I used to videotape the ecumenical conversations that she put together between Arab and Jewish and Christian. And so she influenced me in that way. And I'm very sad that she's gone.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. We are all
Thank you.
sad, but of course not the way that you have experienced her passing. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Rebecca.
I do know that, in her more later years, she was very focused on the Palestinians.
Yes.
And so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad you were able to join us. And again, I want to say my last memory of both you and your family, including your father and mother and your sister, and their families and your partner, was having dinner with your family at the conference with Jan Abu Shakra, who is also on this call. Yeah,
I got to travel a lot because of her.
Yeah.
And got to actually sort of listen to lots of conferences that I would never have gone to, except that she liked to integrate her family into all her travels.
Oh, bless her heart. Thank you. And please pass our greetings on to your father and our sympathies for the loss of Rosemary.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
He is here listening, but he's rather asleep.
Okay. Well, please do give him our sympathy and our greetings for.
Yeah. Thank you for including me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Okay.
So now what we will do is before we ask before we ask Jonathan and Don Wagner to look at, to do a synthesis of this, we're going to open it up for a few minutes to people on the panel, including the two of you. If you have any questions, comments, towards each other, for each other, challenging each other, please do that now. And then after that, we will open it up to Dawn and Jonathan to do a synthesis of what we've heard so far. Who would like to begin? What about Jonathan, as a Palestinian? Nora has spoken as a Palestinian woman. How would you see that Rosemary influenced your thinking, your theology?
Well, one of the things that I have been thinking about is the interaction between theology as an academic discipline and between real life activism. It was interesting listening to, giants of theology speak about the internal politics of their world, where they were not always welcome or allowed to speak their conscience. It was an academic world, but it was also a world with its own rules and regulations. Whereas as an activist, I'm always looking to what is happening on the ground. And to find theologians who are at the top of their game, who are respected academically, who write these books with multitude footnotes that cover the entire field of their particular specialty, but who also have a conscience, who also have a heart, and who also have the courage to speak out and to take risks and to stand with, in this case, Palestinians, but whoever is weak, is vulnerable, is a radical departure from the way things happen in the world. The way things happen in the world is that you may be sympathetic with the poor, but you always stand with the strong and the powerful and the interests. And to find somebody who would be willing to take risks, who would be willing to, in their career, maybe risk something to stand for what they truly believe in. That theology is not just an academic science and discipline, but that it also, how do you relate to what is happening in the world? That for me was a tremendously powerful thing to note.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to challenge one of the other panelists or add something?
I want to go back, if I could. I don't know if Don is going to speak, but go back to Rosemary's courage, which she never identified as courage, because to step into Palestinians at that point, we forget, was downward mobility. And if you look at what was written about her when she first started, including in the Wrath of Jonah, and stuff said behind her back, and stuff said behind my back, and stuff said behind Naeem's back, and to us. It was quite a, and I think by coming back to the explosive origins, and remember, all of us were on a learning curve, culturally, religiously, politically, on the ground, as was said. And speaking from our experience, taking our theology, but from our experience, when I met Palestinians in 1984, I'd been in Israel in 73, but was there just by myself. And through you in 84, met Palestinians. I couldn't turn my back. But how to speak, what to say, especially after the Holocaust, especially with our understandings or the broader understandings of, quote, Arabs in the West. And how Rosemary, what was she to say after being so historically minded in what happened to Jews in history? And how could she find her voice to speak about Palestinians without turning her back on something so central to her, which she never did? And not meeting Jews that were different than the ones he had met. And sometimes fighting it in the beginning, but then also saying, oh, hey, something's happening here. I have to, when you have the experience of dislocation and death from Jews, and then meeting other Jews that are different, what to do with that? So what the heck do you do with a Jew who wants justice for Palestinians? So Rosemary's going to Rosemary again. It seemed effortless. She just saw it and spoke. But think about it. Finding her voice, what to say, how to say it, and to be strong. And in these meetings that Naeem and Rosemary and I had, we had many experiences of things said to us or said to one and not the other. And I remember once challenged in Canada, and Naeem was going to really blast this guy from the Jewish establishment. I took his hand. I put my hand on his hand. And I said,
I remember.
I
Naeem was
remember
like,
that. I
Naeem
remember
was,
that.
Naeem was like a racehorse. You know, he was in one of those stalls ready to go. And I said to myself, let me take care of this. And he did. And I did take care of it. But
Yes.
he also did that with me and Rosemary, you know, so we formed a bond, which to me was the greatest shift in interfaith ecumenical relations. Because we had, and I'll just be brief here, we had the churches embracing Jews for the first time in history. That was the most radical transformation in Christian history. And then all of a sudden, Jews are romanticized. You know, they're beautiful and all of this. And then Palestine. So this was a great shift. Historically, it seems ridiculous. You know, I'm running around there trying to find my voice. Naeem has his voice. Rosemary, you think it couldn't really happen like this. But in terms of interfaith relations, this was a dynamic moment in history, which none of us fully understood. And maybe that's why we could do it. And which now has all sorts of consequences for the good, but a lot of fallout. And that moment is, and you know, Christian peacemakers come out of that movement. You think here are Christian, and I first met them and I thought, wow, they're pro-Jewish and they're for Palestinian freedom, and they're willing to stand up with their bodies. And I'll tell you one last thing. Kathleen Kern, first time I met her, they used to come to my talks and I thought, who are they? And then I first met her and she said, you know, I've read 3 of your books. I said, whoa, wow. What did you get out of those books? She said, a different vision of what it means to be Jewish. But this was true with Naeem, a different vision of what it means to be Palestinian to us in Rosemary. So in the interfaith dialogue, this was the most dynamic moment since Vatican II, in my view, and historically the most important. And Rosemary was central to that. And Naeem was central to that. And I was hanging on there. I was just trying to hang on.
Come on, Mark, you were
Mark.
central. This is Don. Could I just add a vignette to add to what Mark has just said?
Yeah, and then after Dawn, I'm going to call on Nora. She had her hand up as well.
Okay.
I'd love to speak.
Well, Mark and Nora and Kathy and Rosemary were kind of the really 4 horse persons of the apocalypse, breaking new ground in that era. But I think we, you know, the sacrifices Rosemary and all of us went through at that time. But let me just add a vignette about Rosemary. I was just getting into this in the late 70s with the Presbyterian Middle East Task Force, Sojourners, and the Palestinian Human Rights Campaign. We organized one of the first conferences on justice, theological justice for Palestine in LaGrange, Illinois. And we issued a declaration, and within a few months, Rosemary Ruether, writing in the National Catholic Reporter, trashed it as a vicious anti-Semitic attack singling out Israel. I lived in Evanston, about 2 miles from Rosemary, but we had never met. Shortly after that article came out, Rosemary had her first experience where she met Palestinians just before she met Kathy. And she had an awakening, but it was very new. And she wrote about it in the National Catholic Reporter. I had a call from our dear friend Jim Wall, then the chief editor of Christian Century. He said, Don, I'd like to have lunch with you and bring Rosemary Ruether together. I said, okay. I was kind of shuddering what Rosemary was going to do. And at our lunch, Jim revealed and Rosemary discussed how she had just been disinvited by, what is it, the National Conference of Christians and Jews from giving a keynote address. And someone from that office leaked a memo from the ADL that said, Rosemary Ruether is now a threat to the security of Israel. Cancel her. She paid a heavy price, was still a little bit shaken from that. But from that point on, she never backed down and found not only her voice, but then all that awakening that Kathy, Naeem, and Mark and that synergy you all had. But she paid a heavy price for that. It really hurt her. She was world famous for dialogue with Christians and Jews, kind of a darling of the dialogue movement, and suddenly dropped out of the blue. But she adjusted quickly and never backed down again, and always carried the torch, fighting anti-Semitism wherever it is, and fighting for justice in Palestine. And she's a model for how we can bring those together.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Nora.
Okay, let me speak as a woman because there are all men around us.
Yes.
And this is how I relate to Rosemary, really. You know, I first said that she gave us courage as women to voice what we felt. But one of the things that she kept repeating and that stays with me is when she said, anything that lessens the full humanity of women cannot be the divine intent. And so this was taking really us back to the creation of men and women being equal in a world where we still do not see equality. Right before I joined you, I was watching television and I saw Biden coming into Israel and going to the Holocaust Museum and so on. Immediately I thought, Rosemary, where are you? What are you going to tell to your president today? Because you were so particular about when we misuse our traditions and religions to become monopolized by us, and we forget that there are others around us. And one of the things I learned from Mark, we didn't always agree. I've known Mark for years, and we sometimes had lunch in our garden at the Sabil. And once I told Mark, I said, Mark, what do you tell your children about chosenness? And Mark, I always quote you with groups. And he said, I tell my children, you are chosen only when you do the will of God. So you don't have to be Jewish to be chosen. You don't have to be Christian. You don't have to be Muslim. Just be human, do according to the will of God, do not hurt anybody, but demand your rights. And this is what Rosemary had really noticed and brought out in the Palestinian liberation theology. Our theology is one of justice with compassion. And compassion is being able to live with the other without denying the rights that we have, to be able to live in harmony and so on and so forth. So we're very grateful to Rosemary's family. I say thank you for sending us Rosemary over to Palestine, for her to see us also as human beings, because the first thing she said in her lecture at Tantur, she said, why is it that Western Christians do not see Palestinians as human beings? She saw that. And I'm grateful for that because she gives us hope that even if the whole world says something, it doesn't mean it's right. And those of us who have been attacked, whether it's the theologians, Don, Jonathan, myself, we know that it's not always the majority that speaks the truth. And according to Rosemary, we are not afraid and we go ahead. Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you. Okay, there was let's see, another question. I'm not keeping up with the questions here. Jesse, can you help me with the question here?
Yeah, I've been sending you some messages with questions on them. I'm not sure if you.
Yeah, there's many
there.
messages.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Let me go back. So one question, very simple, was what year did the meeting between Rosemary, Naeem, and Mark take place? What year was that?
Okay, Mark, was that at Maryknoll?
I met Maryknoll. I met Rosemary several times. Once at Florida State, then at Maryknoll, and then several times at Maryknoll when I invited her, and then in Israel, Palestine, where she presented me with the outline of her book, which was every paragraph.
Yeah.
Many books, I've never used an outline. I just sit down and write. And I didn't know what she was handing me. It was like a book, every paragraph. So, yeah.
Yeah, that must have been about 89 or 90, I think.
Yeah.
90 was the
we-
conference, so it was definitely before that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, we met several times. So,
Yeah, the three of you.
and when we came for that first conference in Jerusalem, in Tantur, you remember, Kathy, you worked very hard on it. And can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you. Go ahead.
Right,
okay.
you're fine.
Yeah, so that was one, we met in Canada also on this conference that we're talking about. And this conference, I think, is maybe it's important for our group here to be reminded of that. Canada was at one point was mainly influenced by Jewish understanding of the conflict, and the way things happened for us for Canada is that the bishop, I can't think of his name now, but maybe
the Anglican bishop.
Anglican bishop of Canada came to Jerusalem one Christmas or Easter, I can't remember now. He came to visit, and then he came back. When he came back to Canada, he preached on Christmas, a sermon about what happened, what he experienced in Palestine and in Jerusalem. And the Jewish community in Canada hit the ceiling. They were very upset, and they wanted the Anglican bishop to apologize. And the bishop felt that he did not do anything wrong. He really spoke about the oppression of the Palestinian people, the injustice of the Palestinians, and he was not going to apologize. So he had a choice, either to apologize or to get in touch. I don't know how that happened. With Robert Astley, who was already helping us at Sabil, and he's a Sabiler, to get in touch with him. And Robert suggested maybe to invite few of us to talk about Palestinian liberation theology. And that's when Rosemary, Mark, myself, and other people. Don, were you there?
No.
Yeah. Anyway, a number of us were invited by the bishop to come to Ottawa and have a conference. So we were there together. And that's when this incident happened, where I think some of the Jewish people there, pro-Israeli Jews, were very upset that we were shaking the Canadian scene, by now talking about the rights of the Palestinians.
Mm.
And this guy was there trying really to really oppose our stance. And I'm so glad now that when I wanted to jump and address this guy, that really Mark told me to be silent. And I was so thankful, because I was going to be talking out of an emotional perspective rather than a clear thinking. And after a few minutes, Mark addressed or responded to this guy. And it was a beautiful, beautiful, well thought response. And I really appreciated the fact that Mark did not told me to just be quiet, that moment. And so we've been together a number of times in that way. And I can think of other times where I remember also some of the writings of Rosemary. I remember when one time she said about the Jewish people or about the Israeli people that the claim of empowerment in the name of security has been attained at the expense of the just claims of the Palestinians to their land. I mean, think about it, and that was everything, they've been empowered, and they rationalize it because for security. But what about the Palestinian security? What about the Palestinian claim for justice for their land, and so on. So there were so many other things that I can remember where we were together and talking about it with great courage, and I appreciate what Mark has said, So Rosemary really was a force also behind us, encouraging us to speak out, and to take a stand for justice. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Aziz. I wonder if it's time to move on with Jonathan and Dawn to do a bit of a synthesis, and then we have several more questions in the chat function, which we can take on then. Shall we move ahead with Jonathan, and who would like to go first, Jonathan and Dawn?
Go ahead, Don.
I was going to say, go ahead, Jonathan. Well, I'm struck with how Mark reminds us of how explosive it was in those 80s and early 90s to be articulating these things. We didn't have JVP then, but we had a handful of young Jews, and Mark was really kind of a mentor to many and carving out that path. And then the connection with Naim. I remember the two of you doing a seminar in Atlanta with, remember Reverend Tom R.?
Yes, absolutely.
You did like a week of lectures or dialogues or a long weekend. Tom R. was fired shortly after that.
Yeah, he paid it
because of hosting it.
Yeah.
And Tom never backed down.
Yes.
He got it, but he paid a heavy price.
Yes.
And several prices were there. As I mentioned, Rosemary paid a price. So this whole theme of, I think, sacrificial justice is kind of one thing Rosemary modeled, as did Mark, Naim, Nora, Kathy, and so many others. But Samud of never backing down. Rosemary was tough, but she also paid a price, and that's part of our journey. And I think that's something I would just like to lift up and highlight.
Thank you, Don. Jonathan, would you?
Yeah, I wanted to continue the comment I made earlier, and say that in addition to the courage, the commitment, there was also a very high level of scholarship, as well as a high level of taking the broader and the wider perspective. I'm struck now by what Mark is saying, that the situation has changed now. It has almost become convenient or woke to support the Palestinians, at least verbally and publicly. So I am wondering, what are the new challenges theologically for us today, both as theologians and as activists? There is a new situation now where there is a greater recognition that the situation in Palestine is apartheid. And apartheid is a war crime and a crime against humanity. Is there a willingness now to move from simply making statements and resolutions about apartheid to actually doing something about it? The other side has managed, I think, almost successfully to demonize BDS as tactics to use against, in fact, to criminalize BDS in many situations. Is there now a new frontier for courageous theological positions? Is there a new frontier that requires churches, Christians, committed people to start taking new action now that is not only acceptable or politically woke, but that is really effective and that maybe has a price tag on it? I briefly spoke about the need to talk to Hamas and bringing Hamas into the situation. Something like that is explosive, I think. What are the new pathways for a Christian position to be truly in solidarity with Palestinians and maybe to be willing to pay a price for it? That courage, together with a clear-headed understanding of the situation and a willingness to take a position based on faith, based on conscience, based on ethics, is a new frontier. And I definitely welcome the fact that there are many Jews who are at the forefront of this new battle, who are willing, out of their own Jewish commitment and out of their own understanding of their Jewish faith, to take courageous positions in support of and in solidarity, not only with Palestinians, but with a better future for both people, instead of just repeating two-state solution verbiage.
I'd like to add a comment. I think right now, the situation is going to be more difficult for Palestinians and in the US, perhaps UK, Canada. With Biden's trip throwing democracy and Palestinian justice, human rights under the bus, militarizing the conflict, isolating Iran, ignoring Palestinians, I think we got a harder row, but yet it's going to demand more courage, more opposition, and more price to be paid. But I think we're entering, a wrong-headed move by the U.S. In the next few years, really continuing the Trump policies for the most part, both against Iran, militarizing and using Israeli surveillance security instruments field tested on Palestinians and now moved into the Arab world in a new alliance with Israel. So I think we have the road cut out in a very difficult future, but all the more that sacrificial courage is demanded us, as Rosemary is a model for.
Thank you. Thank you both, Jonathan and Dawn. There are so many questions in the chat here that people have been sending me. And I know that there's an electronic hand up, Ignacio. I have one question for all the panelists, but let's go with Ignacio. Can you ask your question? Please unmute yourself.
Good. Actually, it's not a question, but I want to remind us all of the role that Rosemary played in Latin America. I'm originally from Mexico, and I met her in Puebla, the town where I live, when she came to, in 1979, when she came to talk to women who were working on issues, reproductive issues. So her love for Latin America, I think, does not need to be in any kind of competition with her love for Palestine. I think that she was able to connect all of the struggles of all of the peoples and to speak courageously on all of them. And I think at Diana University, and she was able to leave the meeting that we went for in order to be supportive to the women of Colombia, to the Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir. And I think at this point, we need to remember that also because of the threats in our own nation. I live in Claremont. I was privileged to spend tremendous amounts of time with her. I am one of those who believe that she did hear and understand well, even though she had the stroke and she had no ability to respond. That beautiful smile that she gave me every time I talked to her in Spanish told me that she knew who I was and that she understood what I was saying. I loved her. I continue to love her. And I want to say what we say in Latin American meetings. Rosemary, Radford, Ruether, presente.
Presente. Amen.
Thank you so much for sharing that. She definitely was. I think it would be a shame. We have like 14 minutes left. It would be a shame not to talk a little bit more about the future of, both Jewish liberation theology and Palestinian liberation theology, and Latin American. Of course, there's that's a whole other one that we haven't discussed, and thank you for bringing that into the picture. I would like to ask each of the panelists, before there are so many questions, and let me sort them out because there's no way we can ask all of them. Maybe I can ask a few at a time. But Nora, would you be able to start us on this question? What is, maybe I can combine two questions. One, what is the general thinking about Biden going to Israel today? And I know you touched on that already. You mentioned some of that. And then going to Saudi Arabia after that. But also the question also encompasses more than that. The question is, what is generally the Palestinian thinking around what's going on there right now? And we know there's many issues that you are all dealing with. So maybe Nora and Mark, you could and Assis Naim, you could speak to this, and then we can bring in a few other questions.
Well, I think Don said it very clearly.
Yeah,
What the US is doing.
Yeah.
Okay, and coming from a so-called Catholic president, I'm really surprised at the way he acts. I don't think the US is on the right track at the moment, okay? As I said, I mean, injustice is even in your own country, even maybe more so. I sometimes used to say to groups, you need an intifada in your own country. You need an uprising in your own country, because it's really very sad what is happening. It's all politics, but dirty politics. It's again the superpowers that destroyed the Middle East from 1920 and divided it. We see it being implemented. There's no love whatsoever for human beings. It's all about military interest and monetary interest. It's all about economics. So for a long time, many of us peacemakers thought we were trying to influence the world, the churches and the governments to do the right thing, as Rosemary was also speaking about, you know. But now I realize at my age, we're not going anywhere. I mean, it's true, many people have supported BDS. It's true. It's true that some of the churches have taken excellent resolutions, including the Presbyterian Church last week about apartheid and so on. But as long as governments do not take sanctions, do not speak to the spoiled child Israel, that it is not above the law, that it is not chosen other than the others. Excuse me, Mark, but I have to say it. We are all equal. So we all have to try on the local level. I can already see many people working alongside with the Jewish Israeli groups who stand for human rights and justice. It's not coming out of their faith, Jonathan. It's people who really maybe are not very faithful, but who believe in equality, human rights, respect of the other. So there is a movement that is going on between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in our land, okay? The churches, after so many years of work at Sisnaim on ecumenism, have finally picked up that they have to work together in the land. And we hear them even more so after the years that we were trying to change that. So there is hope for me that everything that is being done to destroy this part of the world is not going to be destroyed. And again, I say it comes from my Armenian heritage, my background, that God will not allow injustice to go on. I may not see it. I hope my grandchildren will see it. I hope this land will really return to being a land of milk and honey, and people eventually can learn to be prophetically correct and respect each other. The land can take two peoples if we are honest with each other, if we show love and yet not submit blindly. I think we can do it. We need your support internationally, 100%, because the power is in your country and not in ours. Okay, I'll stop here. Jonathan can say more, or anybody who wants to say more.
Okay, thank you so much, Nora. We actually have 3 minutes. We want to give Don Wagner 5 minutes at the end. So Assis Naim and Mark, would you like to add something to what Nora was saying? And before we give the floor to Don.
Well, I'll chime in for a minute. One of the concerns I have, it's interesting when we get to apartheid, it becomes an easy word to mouth. The churches have never given up anything in the United States. If you look at really, their endowments are billions and billions of dollars, and they talk about 100 million. And there was no reckoning. And what I'm concerned about, because the situation is really much worse, is the universalization of the issue. Colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, it's everywhere. I'm laserly focused on the question of Palestine as a Jew. The particularity of Jews and Palestinians, to me, is being lost. I understand why it is, and I understand the elements that are true about this new movement. But Palestinians are being lost in this, just like Blacks are being lost in the United States when everybody's oppressed, and and they have to also admit it. And it's also true. There are different oppressions and there are also similarities. But who's left behind? That's the question. And my own view is that as Palestinians have become symbolic markers in a universal struggle, they're actually left behind. And for me, and this is why I'm not invited often anywhere anymore, I'm not doing it. It's specific. There's something about Palestine, there's something about Jewish, and it's contextual, I understand. I stay with the particularities.
I can just say also a few words. So long as Israel does not, or so long as Israel actually does not include the Palestinians or does not even recognize that the Palestinians have rights to the land, so long as Israel is not willing to share the land of Palestine with the Palestinians, we will continue to have the problems. The problem is Israel now, especially religious settlers who are in the government, who are controlling the government. They totally negate the Palestinians. And unless they begin to accept that the Palestinians have roots in the land, this land does not belong only to the Jewish people. It belongs to the Palestinians, Christians and Muslims. It is our land together, and we have to live and share it. Unless we do that, unfortunately, we will continue to suffer. All of us will continue to suffer. I'm very disappointed with President Biden, because the United States is not willing to be courageous enough to really honor the demands of international law. Without international law, that brings us together and inclusive, accepting the other. We all have rights, and unless we can live together, we will die together, and we will continue to suffer together. And this is where it is important for us to speak about the future for all of us, not only for one segment of the population.
Thank you so much, Assis. I will, just before I turn this over to Dawn, I would just like to thank everyone for being here. A special thank you to the three panelists, Mark, Nora, and Assis Naim. I also want to thank Jonathan and Dawn for the sharing you've done thus far, and to everyone for participating. I apologize for not getting to all the questions. They were sent to me fast and furiously, and we could not, accommodate them all. Maybe we can get Fazna to do another webinar on some of the questions as a follow-up to this. And thank you, Fazna. Thank you so much, Chad and Jesse, for organizing this. And thanks to Fazna in general. So I'm going to turn this over to Don Wagner now, who is going to lead us in a memorial.
Thank you, Kathy and Mark, Naeem, Nora, and everyone for your incisive thoughts and wisdom that we've shared this hour. Well, I have just a few thoughts. Wanted to lift up maybe a few things that haven't been mentioned, and then close us with a benediction. I always, once I got to know Rosemary and Herc, I was struck by their sense of hospitality, welcoming the stranger, welcoming friends. Their home was a meeting place. There were always students living there. I think Becky and David and Mimi grew up with that kind of a strong hospitality. And I want to recognize Herc, who really held the fort down often when Rosemary was traveling. And Herc himself was a political scientist, really dedicated to Palestine. And anyway, the organizing work they did was phenomenal. Next, I want to remind us to think of Rosemary as alive, not just the past, but a living past that informs and instructs us. One thing that she really was an early disciple of intersectional advocacy. She was doing intersectional advocacy early. I don't know if we all know, she went down to Mississippi, did voters' rights in the mid-60s as a student. We've heard about her commitment to the grape pickers and her commitment to Latin America. She was a close friend of Black liberation theology at a very early stage, co-teaching with James Cone, one of the fathers of Black liberation theology. So this path of intersectionality is a key for us in the future. As a dark cloud descends again on Palestine and militarization of the Middle East, I think we now have new partners. Black Lives Matter, many others in the Black churches, and work to be done there. Latin America, all the Hispanic community, all the gender consciousness and women, the anti-apartheid movement, and now the anti-colonial movement, lifting up settler colonialism. Rosemary pioneered all these things. And now we have to lift it to a new level as we challenge the injustices before us. So Rosemary's spirit is alive and is just simply not going to leave us. But it's up to us now to pick up that mantle. And several of us on this call now, we're entering our 80s, 70s, so we're not going to be around long. But we really need to, we've got the youth movements out there, and we just need to make better connections, do a better job. The churches just have to be pressured more, not just to pass resolutions, but to really do the dirty work of putting pressure on our legislators and expanding all that work. So Rosemary is alive. That spirit is not going to leave. And as some of us depart maybe from our work and our later years, I just look forward and already see that new generation rising. And we must encourage it and lean toward it. So these are just a few thoughts. And again, our condolences to the family. Thank you for being with us today. Blessings, healing, but also celebrate the life and the presence of Rosemary with us. So now let me just say a closing prayer and benediction. And again, thank you to all. This has been a tremendous time together. So let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we celebrate the life, not just the memory, but the living presence, prophetic witness of Rosemary Herc. We ask that we will be infused by her scholarship, but by that advocacy, willing to get our hands dirty for the kingdom and for justice. Thank you for Rosemary's strong commitment to intersectional justice. May we pick up that mantle, advance it to a deeper level in a time that for the short run is going to be much more difficult for Palestine. And as Mark reminds us, may we keep our focus, laser focused on the particularity of Palestine, the injustices done there, and how it is a prism and a model for justice everywhere. And now we ask your love and your presence to bind us, inspire us, motivate us, and rededicate ourselves to the long run that's ahead, giving ourselves each day prayerfully, but in action to the calling we have. And now may the love of God that has brought us together, the communion and power of the Holy Spirit, and the liberating freedom of Christ and all the prophets engage, enliven, and bless us as we go forward to do the work Rosemary has charted before us. In the name of that Spirit we pray, amen and amen.
Amen.
And
Thank you, Don. Thank you, panelists, especially Nora, Mark, and Assis Naim, Jonathan and Don Wagner. Halamakum.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Kathy.
Shukran and Samud.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Okay. Can we leave?
Yes.